Hello everybody. Today I can write intervals by stating the x values where each piece starts and stops. We're going to do both set builder notation and interval notation, although for me, my go-to is going to be interval notation, so let's start with that. For interval notation, I'm always looking from left to right where each piece starts and stops. So I'm all the way out here at the left right now. Is there a graph out here at the left? Yes. So I'm starting at negative infinity. I have graph, I have graph, I have graph, I have graph. My graph stops at 4. Now, if 4 is included, it gets a bracket. If it's not included, it gets a parenthesis. Since it's an open circle, it gets a parenthesis. And negative infinity always gets a parenthesis, or any infinity gets a parenthesis, because you can never be equal to infinity. A little trick to help you remember that is that infinity is curvy and a parenthesis is curvy. Let's just stick with interval notation for a moment. The second one, do I have graph all the way out here at the left? No. Here, let's just do it this way. Let's get a little vertical line action going on here. So let's take this line. I don't have anything out here to the left. At what x value does the graph start? Well, it starts at 2. Comma. I have graph, 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 graph. Do I have graph all the way out here at the right? Yes. That is positive infinity. Since 2 has an open circle, it's not included. It's a parenthesis, and infinity always gets a parenthesis. The next one, do I have graph all the way here at the left? No. My graph starts at negative 3. So I'm going to write negative 3, comma. I have graph, 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 graph. It goes on forever, infinity. Infinity always gets a parenthesis. And the negative 3, since it's a closed circle, it's included, it gets a bracket. Let's stick with interval notation for the next piece, because it never changes. So let's get my vertical line back. Do I have graph all the way out here to the left? No. My graph starts at negative 10. I have graph, 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 graph. It stops at negative 3. They both have open circles. That's it. Let's jump ahead to number 14. I have graph all the way to the left, so that is negative infinity, comma. I have graph, 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 graph. Graph stops at negative 5. Since there's a closed circle, it gets a bracket. But now there's another piece. So now I'm just going to make another set. So this one starts at 0. So I'm going to write 0, comma. I have graph, 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 graph. It goes on forever. Infinity. Infinity always gets a parenthesis. The 0 gets a parenthesis since it's open. And technically, you're supposed to write or in between them if there's two pieces, but I'm not too concerned about that. Now, let's talk about set builder notation. When you have an infinity involved, x always comes first. So since all three of these have an infinity involved, x always comes first. If it's going to negative infinity, it's less than. If it's going to positive infinity, it's greater than. Positive infinity, greater than. If it has the bracket, it gets the equals. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. So this is x is less than 4. This is x is greater than 2. This is x is greater than or equal to negative 3. When you do not have an infinity involved, it's always less than x less than in between. When there's not an infinity involved, it's always less than x less than in between. And then the first number comes first, and the last number comes last. If there is an equals, if there's a bracket or a closed circle, I put an equals. If not, I don't. These each have an infinity involved. So x comes first. X is less than or equal to negative 5, or x is greater than 0. So if we mix it all together, That's what this is here. It's kind of a mix of it all together. Let's go interval notation first. Number 18. Do I have graph all the way to the left? Yes. So that is negative infinity, comma. I have graph, 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 graph until I get to negative 3. I have no other pieces. The negative 3 is closed, so it gets a bracket. Infinities always get parentheses. For set notation, since there's an infinity involved, x comes first. X is less than or equal to negative 3. If it's negative infinity, it'll be less than. If it's positive infinity, it'll be greater than. Number 19, I have graph all the way to the left, so I'm starting at negative infinity, comma. My graph ends at negative 5. Negative 5 is closed, so it gets a bracket. Negative infinity always gets a parentheses. But I got another piece, so I'm going to write or, and then I'm going to continue 0 to infinity. 0 is open. Oops. 0 to infinity. In set notation, since for each of them they have infinity, x comes first. X is less than or equal to negative 5. Or, again, since there's an infinity, x comes first. X is greater than 0. Let's skip ahead to number 21. Nothing out here to the left. It starts at negative 8. Ends at negative 2. So that's negative 8 to negative 2. Parenthesis, parenthesis, because they're both open. Now, since there is no infinity, whenever you're in between two numbers, it's always less than x less than. The first number comes first. The last number comes last. So the main thing to know, if there's no infinity involved, it's always less than x less than. First number first, last number last. If there is an infinity involved, then your x is going to be written first for set notation. That being said, the main thing is if you can just do it in interval notation, just left to right where the graph starts and stops. That's it. Practice. Bye.